Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey, not through time in a shiny, comfortable DeLorean, but through the murky, gaslit alleys of Victorian England. Imagine, if you will, the faint scent of coal smoke mingling with the damp earth, the distant clang of a horse-drawn carriage, and the unsettling quiet that settles over the cobblestones after midnight. You're there, a shadow among shadows, about to witness a truth so stark, so utterly devoid of modern comfort, that it might just make you appreciate your weighted blanket a little more. This isn't a fairy tale, and folks, this is the brutal reality of how Victorians treated mental illness. And let's be honest, if you found yourself in their shoes, you probably wouldn't have survived the first week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a street corner, the fog thick around your ankles, muffling the sounds of the bustling city that still hums faintly in the background. The year is, let's say, 1870. The air is heavy with the promise of industrial might, but also with a pervasive sense of unease. You glance at your reflection in a shop window, a fleeting glimpse of a face perhaps a little too pale, eyes a little too wide, a cough, a nervous twitch, a tendency to speak too loudly or too softly on us in this era. These aren't just quirks, they are potential red flags, whispers of a darkness that could consume you whole. The Victorians. Bless their corseted, top-hatted souls, were obsessed with order, with rigid social structures, and with the appearance of sanity. Any deviation, any crack in the polished veneer of polite society, was seen not just as an inconvenience, but as a threat. And if that deviation manifested as something they deemed madness, well, then your fate was sealed. You see, the concept of mental illness as a medical condition, something to be understood and treated with empathy, was still in its terrifying infancy. Instead, it was often viewed through a lens of moral failing, spiritual affliction, or simply an inconvenient eccentricity that needed to be contained. You walk past a grand house, its windows glowing with gaslight, casting long, dancing shadows. Inside, you imagine a family, perhaps discussing the latest scientific marvels or the virtues of hard work. But what if one of them, a beloved aunt or a quiet cousin, began to exhibit behaviors deemed unsuitable? Perhaps she started talking to herself, or refused to leave her room, or worse, became agitated and spoke her mind too freely. In our time, you might suggest therapy, medication, or just a quiet conversation. In theirs, the whispers would begin. She's not herself. A touch of the vapors. Perhaps a change of scenery is in order. And that change of scenery often meant one thing: the asylum. The very word asylum once held a glimmer of hope, a promise of refuge. It was meant to be a place of safety, a sanctuary for those whose minds had strayed. But the reality, as you're about to discover, was far more complex and often far more chilling. You might imagine a serene pastoral setting, a place where gentle walks and quiet contemplation could restore a troubled mind. And indeed, some early proponents of moral treatment envisioned just that. But the sheer scale of the problem, coupled with a profound lack of understanding and resources, quickly turned these havens into something else entirely. Consider the sheer volume of people who could suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of sanity. A woman suffering from postpartum depression, a man struggling with what we now recognize as bipolar disorder, a child with developmental differences, all could be swept away, their rights stripped, their voices silenced. The legal framework was, to put it mildly, rudimentary. A family could commit a loved one with relative ease, often without a formal diagnosis or any real recourse for the individual. Imagine the terror of being declared insane by your own family, stripped of your autonomy, and sent away to a place from which few ever truly returned. At least not in the same way. You notice a newspaper vendor shouting headlines, his voice hoarse in the cold air. You catch snippets: lunacy laws debated, asylum conditions exposed. Even then, there were glimmers of public awareness, faint cries for reform. But these were often drowned out by the prevailing attitudes of the time. Madness was something to be hidden, to be ashamed of, a stain on the family name. It was a secret to be kept, locked away behind high walls, far from the prying eyes of society. It was a convenient truth for those who sought to maintain the illusion of perfect, rational order. The Victorians had a peculiar fascination with categorizing everything, from beetles to social classes, and mental illness was no exception. They had a dizzying array of terms, many of which now sound utterly bizarre to your modern ears: melancholia, mania, moral insanity, puerperal insanity, monomania. These weren't precise medical diagnoses, but rather broad labels, often reflecting societal anxieties more than genuine understanding. Moral insanity, for instance, was a particularly insidious concept, suggesting that madness wasn't just a defect of the mind, but a defect of character, a failure to adhere to the strict moral codes of the era. If you were deemed morally insane, you weren't just sick, you were bad. And that, dear listener, was a very dangerous label indeed. You might wonder, Aki, what caused this widespread madness in the first place? Was it the smog? The rigid social expectations, the sheer quantity of laudanum consumed by everyone for everything, from a headache to a broken heart? Historians still debate the precise interplay of social, environmental, and biological factors that contributed to the perceived rise in mental illness during the Victorian era. Some argue that industrialization and rapid urbanization led to increased stress and social dislocation. Others point to dietary deficiencies, widespread disease, or even genetic predispositions. What's clear is that the Victorians were grappling with a phenomenon they barely understood, and their solutions were often a reflection of their fear and ignorance. Imagine a young woman, perhaps a seamstress, working long hours in a cramped, dimly lit workshop. Her diet is poor, her living conditions worse. She develops a persistent cough, her hands begin to tremble, and she finds herself unable to sleep, plagued by anxieties about making ends meet. In her exhaustion, she might become irritable, withdrawn, or even prone to sudden outbursts. To a Victorian doctor, this might not be seen as the result of poverty and exploitation, but as a manifestation of nervous debility or hysteria. The solution, not improved working conditions or better nutrition, but perhaps a rest cure, which often involved forced bed rest, isolation, and a diet of milk, sometimes for months on end. Sounds relaxing. Right, like a spa day. If the spa day involved being treated like a fragile doll whose only purpose was to lie still and be fed gruel, the concept of nervousness was pervasive. Anything from a slight tremor to a full-blown panic attack could be attributed to overstimulation or a weak nervous system, and the cures were, shall we say, imaginative. You might be prescribed a course of electric shocks, not the kind used in modern electroconvulsive therapy, but often crude, unregulated jolts, or perhaps a water cure involving cold baths, douches, or even being wrapped in wet sheets. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we talked about in another episode? Well, these cures were often just as scientifically sound. One particularly obscure detail from this period is the widespread use of tranquilizing chairs. These were essentially chairs designed to restrain patients, sometimes for hours on end, to calm them. Imagine being strapped into a chair, unable to move, your mind racing, while the world outside continued its indifferent hum. It's a stark reminder that the line between treatment and punishment was often blurred beyond recognition. The goal was often control, not healing. The Victorian era was also a time of burgeoning scientific inquiry, yet this often coexisted with deeply superstitious beliefs. While some doctors were attempting to understand the brain, others still clung to ideas about humoral imbalances or even demonic possession. It was a strange blend of nascent science and lingering medievalism. You might find a doctor meticulously dissecting a brain in one room, while in another, a patient is being subjected to a spinning cure, literally spun around in a chair until they vomit or pass out. The idea being to realign their brain, it's enough to make you dizzy just thinking about it. The very architecture of the asylums themselves speaks volumes. Many were imposing, fortress-like structures, designed to keep people in, rather than to invite healing. High walls, barred windows, and labyrinthine corridors created a sense of confinement, of being cut off from the world. You might walk down a long hallway, the echoing footsteps of an attendant the only sound, and feel the chill of isolation seep into your bones. The sheer scale of some of these institutions was staggering. They were often small towns unto themselves, housing hundreds, even thousands of patients. The idea was to remove the afflicted from society, to make them invisible, to forget they ever existed. And what of the staff? The attendants, the nurses, the doctors. They operated within a system that often dehumanized both the patient and, to some extent, themselves. While there were undoubtedly compassionate individuals, the prevailing culture was one of control and often fear. Attendants were poorly paid, overworked, and often lacked any formal training in mental health care. Their methods could be harsh, relying on physical restraint, solitary confinement, and even violence to manage uncooperative patients. It was a recipe for abuse, and tragically, abuse was all too common. You might hear the faint cries from a distant ward, or the unsettling silence from another. The air itself seems to carry the weight of unspoken suffering. The Victorians, for all their advancements in engineering and empire building, struggled profoundly with the complexities of the human mind. They built magnificent railways and intricate sewer systems. But when it came to the inner workings of thought and emotion, they were often lost in the dark, groping for answers with blunt instruments. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? To imagine yourself in that time, facing a challenge to your sanity, and knowing that the very institutions meant to help might instead become your greatest tormentors. The brutal truth is that for many, the asylum was not a place of recovery, but a place where hope withered and individuality was systematically erased. It was a testament to a society grappling with its own anxieties, projecting its fears onto those who deviated from the norm, and then locking them away. The chill of the night air still clings to your coat as you find yourself standing before an imposing structure, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. This isn't just any building, it's an asylum. The very word a heavy sigh on the wind. You remember the whispers, the hushed conversations about a change of scenery. And now you understand? This is where those changes often led. The gates, tall and wrought iron, seem to swallow the light. And as they creak open, you feel a distinct shiver not from the cold, but from the unsettling certainty that once inside, the world you knew will shrink to the confines of these walls. You step through, and the air immediately feels different. It's not just the absence of street noise, but a peculiar stillness. A quiet hum that seems to vibrate with unspoken stories. The initial impression, surprisingly, isn't one of outright horror. Many of these early Victorian asylums, especially the private ones, were designed with a certain grandiosity. They boasted manicured lawns, impressive facades, and perhaps even a chapel or a library. The idea, at least on paper, was noble to provide a calming, structured environment away from the stresses of modern life. A place where troubled minds could find peace and, hopefully but recovery. This was the promise of the asylum, a gilded cage indeed, offering comfort while simultaneously stripping away freedom. You walk along a gravel path, the crunch underfoot echoing in the quiet. The buildings are often symmetrical, designed with a rigid order that reflected the Victorian obsession with control. You might notice separate wings for men and women, for the curable and the incurable, for the wealthy and the poor. Even in madness, the rigid class structure of the era persisted. If you had money, you might find yourself in a private room with a window overlooking a garden. If you were destitute, you'd likely be in a crowded dormitory, your bed one of many in a vast hall. It's almost like a 5-star hotel versus a budget hostel, except both are equally difficult to check out of. The philosophy behind these institutions, particularly in the earlier part of the century, was heavily influenced by moral treatment. This wasn't about morality in the sense of right and wrong, but about treating patients with kindness, respect, and providing a structured routine. The theory was that madness was often a result of external stressors or a lack of self-control, and that a calm, orderly environment, combined with gentle persuasion and meaningful activity, could restore reason. You might imagine patients engaging in light work like gardening, weaving, or reading, encouraged to maintain their dignity and self-worth. It sounds rather enlightened, doesn't it? Almost progressive. And for a brief, shining moment, It was, you enter a reception area, perhaps a grand hall with high ceilings and a large fireplace, now cold. The air smells faintly of disinfectant and something else you can't quite place. Perhaps the lingering scent of old anxieties. A stern-faced attendant, dressed in a crisp, dark uniform, gestures for you to follow. There's a formality, almost a clinical detachment, that sets the tone. You are no longer an individual with a name and a past. You are now a patient, an inmate, a case. One common historical fact about Victorian asylums is that they were often built in rural areas, far from the prying eyes of urban society. This was partly for practical reasons. Land was cheaper, and the fresh air was believed to be beneficial, but also to ensure that the unfortunates were kept out of sight and out of mind. It was a convenient way to maintain the illusion of a perfectly sane and orderly society. Out of sight, out of mind. Right. Except for the families who carried the secret shame, and the patients who carried the burden of their confinement, consider the sheer logistics. As the population grew, so did the number of people deemed mad. Asylums, initially designed for dozens, soon housed hundreds, then thousands. The staff-to-patient ratio plummeted, making individualized care an impossibility. The gentle persuasion of moral treatment gave way to the practicalities of managing large, often distressed populations. This is where the promise began to fray, and the cage, once gilded, started to show its true, unadorned bars. You are shown to a room, perhaps a small, sparsely furnished space with a narrow bed and a single chair. The window, though barred, offers a glimpse of the outside world, a patch of sky, a distant tree. It's a cruel tease, a constant reminder of the freedom you've lost. You might try to open the window, but it's locked. Of course, everything here is locked. Your clothes are taken, replaced with a plain institutional gown. Your personal belongings, any small mementos of your former life, are cataloged and stored away, perhaps never to be seen again. It's a systematic stripping away of identity, a process designed to make you conform, to erase the madness by erasing the individual. An obscure detail from this period is the use of exercise yards that were often enclosed by high walls, sometimes even with netting overhead, to prevent escapes. Imagine being exercised in a space that felt more like a prison yard than a recreational area. It was a stark contrast to the idyllic gardens often depicted in promotional materials for these institutions. It's like being promised a leisurely stroll in a park and ending up in a very large, very secure dog run. The daily routine, you quickly learn, is rigid and unyielding. Wake-up calls at dawn, simple meals at set times, prescribed periods of exercise or occupation. There's little room for spontaneity, for individual preference, for anything that might disrupt the carefully constructed order. This routine, while intended to bring stability, often served to further alienate patients, turning them into cogs in a vast, impersonal machine. You might try to resist, to assert your will, but you quickly learn that resistance is futile, met with stern warnings, or worse, physical restraint. The concept of lunacy itself was a broad umbrella, encompassing everything from severe mental illness to what we would now consider learning disabilities, epilepsy, or even just old age and senility. This lack of precise diagnosis meant that people with vastly different needs and conditions were often housed together, leading to chaotic and often distressing environments. Imagine someone suffering from profound depression being forced to share a ward with someone experiencing manic episodes or violent delusions. It was a recipe for fear and misunderstanding, both among patients and between patients and staff. Historians still debate whether the rapid expansion of asylums in the Victorian era was primarily driven by genuine philanthropic intent or by a societal need to simply contain and control those deemed undesirable. Was it an earnest, if misguided, attempt at care, or a convenient solution to a growing social problem? The truth, as with most historical complexities, likely lies somewhere in the middle, a messy blend of good intentions and practical failures. You observe the other patients. Some sit in silent contemplation, their eyes vacant. Others pace endlessly, muttering to themselves. Still others engage in repetitive, seemingly meaningless tasks. You see the fear in some faces, the resignation in others. There's a palpable sense of lostness, of lives derailed and forgotten. You might try to speak to someone, to offer a kind word, but your attempts are often met with confusion, suspicion, or simply silence. The isolation here is profound, even in a crowded room. The staff, though few in number relative to the patients, are omnipresent. Their watchful eyes follow your every move. They enforce the rules with an unwavering hand, their authority absolute. You might see an attendant gently guiding a confused patient, but you also witness moments of harshness, a sharp word, a forceful grip. The line between care and control is thin and often crossed. It's a constant reminder that your fate here is not your own. The diet, you discover, is monotonous and bland gruel. Bread, weak tea. It's enough to sustain life, but little more. There's no joy in eating, no pleasure in the simple act of nourishment. It's just another part of the routine, another way to strip away the small comforts of life. You might find yourself longing for a simple piece of fruit, a taste of something fresh and vibrant. But such luxuries are unheard of here. The gilded cage is now fully revealed. The initial promise of sanctuary has dissolved into the stark reality of confinement. The grand architecture feels less like a healing space, and more like a monument to a society that preferred to lock away its problems rather than truly understand them. You are a prisoner of good intentions, a captive of a system that, despite its stated aims, often perpetuated the very suffering it claimed to alleviate. The days blend into one another, marked only by the change of light through the barred window. The outside world, once a constant presence, begins to feel distant, unreal. Your own memories start to blur, the edges of your past softening, fading. This is the insidious power of the asylum. It doesn't just confine your body. It begins to reshape your mind, to make you forget who you were, to accept who you are now, a patient, an inmate, a forgotten soul. It's like being stuck in a never-ending Monday, but with less coffee and more existential dread. You might try to write a letter to send a message to the outside world, but all correspondence is censored, read by the staff, and often never sent if it contains anything deemed unsuitable or delusional. Your voice is not your own here. Your thoughts are not your own. Your very existence is dictated by the rules of the institution. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? To be so completely erased, so utterly powerless. The asylum was a reflection of Victorian society's anxieties about progress, morality, and the very nature of sanity. It was a place where the uncomfortable truths about the human mind were swept under the rug, hidden behind imposing facades and rigid routines. And as you settle into the unsettling rhythm of life within these walls, you begin to understand the true brutality of their approach to mental illness, not just in the treatments, but in the very act of confinement itself. The initial shock of arrival has faded, replaced by a dull, persistent ache of routine. You are now fully immersed in the daily despair that permeates the very stones of this asylum. The grand facades and manicured lawns you glimpsed upon entering feel like a distant, cruel joke. Here, within these inner walls, life is stripped down to its bare, unyielding essentials. Every day unfolds with a monotonous predictability, a slow, grinding erosion of the self. Your mornings begin before the sun has fully ascended, heralded not by a gentle alarm, but by the jarring clang of a bell or the gruff shout of an attendant. You are roused from a fitful sleep on a narrow, hard bed, the thin mattress offering little comfort against the chill that seems to seep into every corner of the room. The air is always cool, sometimes damp, carrying the faint, unsettling scent of institutional cleanliness mixed with something less definable, perhaps the collective anxiety of hundreds of confined souls. You are expected to rise immediately, to dress in the coarse uniform clothing provided, and to join the silent procession towards the washrooms. The washrooms themselves are stark. Communal spaces, cold water, harsh soap, and the constant presence of watchful attendants ensure that personal hygiene is a functional rather than a private act. There's no lingering, no quiet moments of self-reflection in front of a mirror. You are one of many, a cog in the morning machine. And any deviation from the prescribed movements is met with a sharp glance or a terse command. It's an early lesson in compliance, a subtle reminder that your body, like your mind, is no longer entirely your own. Breakfast follows, a meager affair served in a large, echoing dining hall, The clatter of tin plates and mugs against bare wooden tables is the dominant sound, punctuated by the occasional cough or whispered word. The food is, as you've come to expect, bland and unvaried gruel. Perhaps a piece of stale bread and weak tea. It's sustenance, nothing more. There's no conversation, no shared laughter, no sense of community. Each patient sits in their assigned spot, eyes often downcast, consuming their portion with a quiet resignation. You find yourself eating quickly, not out of hunger, but to escape the oppressive atmosphere, the palpable sense of despair that hangs in the air like a heavy curtain. After breakfast, the occupation begins. This is where the Victorian belief in the therapeutic power of work comes into play, though often twisted into something far less beneficial. For men, this might involve manual labor tending to the asylum's grounds, working in the laundry, or performing simple repairs. For women, it could be sewing, knitting, or domestic tasks within the wards. The work is rarely stimulating or engaging. It's repetitive, often tedious, and designed more to keep hands busy and bodies tired than to provide any real sense of purpose or accomplishment. You might find yourself mending endless piles of institutional linens, the needle pricking your finger repeatedly as your mind wanders. Or perhaps you are tasked with sweeping a long corridor, the broom a familiar extension of your arm, the dust motes dancing in the sliver of sunlight that penetrates the high windows. The sheer monotony is a form of torture in itself, a slow erosion of intellectual engagement. There's no creativity, no challenge, just the endless repetition of simple tasks. It's like being stuck in a perpetual assembly line. But the product is just more boredom. A common historical fact about the daily life in Victorian asylums is the emphasis on strict adherence to schedules and routines. This was believed to be crucial for restoring order to the disordered mind. The idea was that a predictable, structured environment would impose a sense of normalcy and discipline, thereby helping patients regain control over their thoughts and behaviors. While some structure can be beneficial, the extreme rigidity often employed left little room for individual needs or expressions, often exacerbating feelings of helplessness and despair. Amidst the forced labor, you observe the staff. They move with an air of weary authority, their faces often impassive. Their numbers are few, stretched thin across vast wards, meaning that true individualized care is virtually impossible. Their primary role seems to be maintaining order, preventing outbursts, and ensuring compliance. You might see an attendant physically guiding a resistant patient, or hear a sharp word delivered to someone who has strayed from their assigned task. The power dynamic is stark and undeniable. One particularly obscure detail from the daily lives of patients is the practice of airing. This involved patients being led out into enclosed exercise yards, often for a prescribed period, regardless of the weather. Imagine standing in a bleak, walled courtyard, perhaps in the biting wind or a light drizzle, with nothing to do but pace or stare at the sky. These airings were less about genuine recreation and more about providing a controlled outlet for physical energy, preventing patients from becoming completely sedentary, and perhaps offering a brief, tantalizing glimpse of the outside world, a world that felt increasingly distant and unreal. The afternoons often mirror the morning's more occupation, followed by another bland meal. There are no newspapers, no books beyond a few worn religious texts, no stimulating conversations. The outside world, with its political upheavals, its scientific discoveries, its vibrant cultural life, feels utterly disconnected from your existence here. You are in a bubble, a strange, timeless limbo where the only reality is the asylum itself. The lack of intellectual stimulation is profound. Your mind, once perhaps teeming with thoughts, worries, or creative impulses, begins to feel dulled, stagnant. There's nothing to engage it, nothing to challenge it, nothing to inspire it. You might try to recall details from your past, snippets of conversations, faces of loved ones, but even these memories begin to fade, becoming hazy and indistinct. It's as if the asylum is slowly, systematically, erasing your former self. You might witness a visiting day, a rare and often fraught occasion. Families, if they still remember or care to visit, arrive with a mixture of hope, apprehension, and perhaps a touch of shame. The visits are often supervised, brief, and conducted in a formal setting, making genuine connection difficult. You might see a patient desperately clinging to a loved one, or conversely, withdrawing into themselves, unable or unwilling to bridge the chasm that has opened between them and the outside world. For many, these visits only serve to highlight the depth of their isolation, the painful reality of their confinement. It's like watching a silent movie of your old life, but you can't hear the dialogue anymore. The evenings bring a different kind of quiet, a settling hush as the asylum prepares for night. Patients are often gathered in common rooms, sitting in rows, sometimes listening to a reading from the Bible or a moralistic tale. There's no entertainment, no music, no games. The atmosphere is heavy with the collective exhaustion of the day and the unspoken dread of the night. You might find yourself drifting into a semi-conscious state, your mind too weary to resist the encroaching quiet. Bedtime is early, enforced with the same rigid efficiency as every other part of the day. You return to your narrow bed, the darkness of the room offering little comfort. The sounds of the asylum at night are different, distant moans, the shuffling of feet, the occasional cry from a disturbed patient, the soft creak of floorboards as an attendant makes their rounds. These sounds become the soundtrack to your nights, a constant reminder of where you are and who you are now. The lack of privacy is another constant assault on your dignity. Every aspect of your life is observed, controlled, and recorded. Your conversations are monitored, your letters read, your movements tracked. There's no personal space, no sanctuary for your thoughts. It's an environment designed to strip away individuality, to mold you into a compliant, manageable patient. Historians still debate the true effectiveness of these rigid routines. While some argue that structure could indeed provide a sense of security for certain patients, others contend that it often stifled any chance of genuine recovery, leading instead to institutionalization and a further deterioration of mental health. Was the routine truly therapeutic, or was it merely a convenient way to manage large numbers of people with minimal staff? The answer, like so many aspects of Victorian mental health care, remains complex and deeply unsettling. You might try to find solace in small acts of rebellion, a whispered conversation with a fellow patient, a hidden drawing on a scrap of paper, a moment of quiet contemplation stolen when no one is watching. These tiny acts of defiance are your only means of asserting your remaining humanity, of holding on to a sliver of your former self. But even these are fraught with risk, for any deviation from the norm can lead to punishment, solitary confinement, physical restraint, or the dreaded cold bath. The physical environment itself often contributed to the despair. Overcrowding was rampant, especially in public asylums. Patients were often crammed into wards with insufficient ventilation and poor sanitation. Disease was common, and the general conditions could be squalid. Imagine the oppressive heat of summer in a crowded ward, the stifling air, the pervasive odors, or the biting cold of winter, with inadequate heating and thin blankets. These were not environments conducive to healing, but rather to further suffering. The emotional toll is immense. You live in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing when an attendant might appear, when a new rule might be imposed, or when a fellow patient might have an outburst. The fear of punishment, the longing for freedom, and the pervasive sense of helplessness gnaw at your spirit. You might find yourself retreating further into your own mind, building walls around your thoughts, creating an internal sanctuary that no one can penetrate. This daily despair, this slow, systematic erosion of self, was perhaps the most brutal aspect of the Victorian asylum experience. It wasn't always about dramatic, violent cures, but about the quiet, relentless grind of institutional life. It was about being stripped of your autonomy, your dignity, and ultimately your very identity. The gilded cage, you now understand, was designed not just to contain, but to transform, to break, to erase. And as the days turn into weeks, and the weeks into months, you begin to wonder if there will be anything left of you to remember the world outside, or even to remember yourself. The dull ache of routine has settled deep into your bones. But today, a different kind of apprehension stirs. The whispers you've heard, the hushed conversations among patients, all point to the treatments. You've seen the attendants preparing various contraptions, heard the distant cries that sometimes punctuate the asylum's oppressive quiet. Today, you understand. It might be your turn to face the doctor's arsenal, a collection of cures designed more to subdue than to truly heal. You are led not to a quiet room for conversation, but to a clinical space, stark and uninviting. The air here is sharper, perhaps with the scent of chemicals or the metallic tang of fear. On a nearby table, you might glimpse an array of instruments that look more suited to a torture chamber than a medical facility. This is where the Victorian era's burgeoning scientific curiosity met its profound ignorance of the human mind, resulting in methods that, to your modern sensibilities, are nothing short of barbaric. One common historical fact is the widespread use of hydrotherapy or water cures in various forms. This wasn't a relaxing spa day. Mind you, you might be subjected to cold sheet packs, where you are tightly wrapped in sheets soaked in icy water, often for hours and until your body temperature drops significantly. The idea was that the shock would calm agitated patients or stimulate those who were withdrawn. Imagine the bone-chilling cold, the constriction of the wet fabric, the inability to move, all while your teeth chatter uncontrollably. It was less about soothing the nerves and more about inducing a state of hypothermia-induced compliance. Or perhaps you'd face the douche bath, a forceful jet of cold water directed at various parts of your body, sometimes even your head. The Victorians believed this intense stimulation could shock the madness out of you. It's like trying to fix a complex computer virus by throwing a bucket of ice water on the monitor. You might get a reaction, but it's probably not the one you were hoping for. The sheer force of the water, the sudden chill, and the indignity of the procedure were designed to break your will, to make you compliant through sheer physical discomfort. You might also hear hushed mentions of spinning chairs. This obscure detail involves a patient being strapped into a chair that would then be spun rapidly, sometimes for extended periods, until they became dizzy, nauseous, or even lost consciousness. The theory, as bizarre as it sounds, was that this centrifugal force would realign the brain or redistribute the blood, thereby curing the mental imbalance. Imagine the disorienting blur, the churning in your stomach, the feeling of your mind being violently scrambled. It was a crude, terrifying attempt to physically manipulate the brain, with little understanding of its delicate complexity. It's like trying to fix a broken clock by shaking it violently. You might get a temporary tick, but you're more likely to just break it further. Then there was the use of purgatives and emetics, designed to cleanse the body of impurities believed to cause madness. You might be given powerful laxatives or substances to induce vomiting, often to an extreme degree. The belief was that mental illness was linked to physical blockages or toxins. So, if you were feeling melancholic, the doctor might decide you needed a good, thorough purge. The discomfort, the weakness, and the sheer indignity of these treatments were immense. It was a truly holistic approach. If by holistic you mean making you miserable from every possible angle, for those deemed agitated or violent, physical restraint was a common, often brutal solution. You might find yourself in a straitjacket, a canvas garment designed to bind your arms tightly across your chest. Or perhaps you'd be confined to a restraint bed, with straps to secure your limbs. These weren't just for moments of extreme danger. They were often used for prolonged periods, sometimes for days, to control patients who were simply restless, noisy, or uncooperative. The feeling of being completely immobilized, unable to move a muscle, while your mind raced, must have been a torment beyond words. Historians still debate the extent to which these cures were genuinely believed to be therapeutic versus being primarily tools for control and management in overcrowded institutions. Was the spinning chair truly seen as a path to recovery? Or was it a convenient way to subdue a difficult patient when staff were scarce? The line between treatment and punishment was often blurred, and the lack of scientific understanding made it difficult to discern genuine care from coercive practices. You might also encounter the infamous moral management techniques, which, despite their name, could be quite harsh. This included solitary confinement, often in dark, unheated rooms, for days or even weeks. The idea was that isolation would force the patient to reflect on their behavior and regain control. But for someone already struggling with their mental state, this extreme isolation could be profoundly damaging, exacerbating delusions, paranoia, or depression. It's like trying to cure a fear of heights by locking someone in a windowless closet. For patients who refused food, Force feeding was a common practice. This involved inserting a tube through the nose or mouth and pouring liquid nourishment directly into the stomach. While sometimes necessary to prevent starvation, the procedure was often traumatic, performed without consent, and could be a terrifying experience, especially for those already experiencing paranoia or delusions about being poisoned. Imagine the tube being forced down, the gagging, the feeling of utter powerlessness. The use of drugs, while not as sophisticated as today, was also part of the arsenal. Opium and its derivatives, like laudanum, were widely used as sedatives, often to keep patients quiet and manageable. Chloral hydrate was another popular sedative, sometimes referred to as knockout drops. While these drugs could induce a temporary calm, they were highly addictive and often left patients in a perpetual state of stupor, further dulling their minds and hindering any chance of genuine recovery. It was a chemical straitjacket, a way to silence the mind without understanding its cries. You might hear a doctor discussing cupping or blistering. Cupping involved placing heated glass cups on the skin to create a vacuum, drawing blood to the surface, believed to draw out impurities. Blistering involved applying irritants to the skin to create painful blisters, also thought to drain the body of harmful substances. These were painful, invasive procedures based on outdated medical theories, yet they were widely accepted as legitimate treatments for various ailments, including mental illness. It's a testament to how desperate people were for answers, even if those answers involved a lot of intentional pain, one particularly chilling, though less common. Practice was the use of trepanning, where a hole was drilled into the skull to relieve pressure or allow evil spirits to escape. While this practice dates back to ancient times, it still saw occasional use in the Victorian era, particularly for conditions like epilepsy or severe headaches that were sometimes linked to madness. The sheer invasiveness and danger of such a procedure, performed without modern anesthetics or sterile conditions, makes your stomach churn. The doctors themselves, while often well-intentioned, operated within the limited understanding of their time. They were often overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients and the complexity of the conditions they faced. Their training was rudimentary by modern standards, and their theories often a mix of observation, superstition, and crude experimentation. They were trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and a hammer as their only tool. You might observe a doctor examining a patient, perhaps feeling their pulse, inspecting their tongue, or asking a series of questions that seem utterly irrelevant to their distress. The focus was often on physical symptoms, even when the underlying problem was clearly psychological. The mind, in many ways, remained a black box, its intricacies beyond their grasp. The psychological impact of these treatments was immense, even if they didn't cause physical harm. The indignity, the fear, and the sense of powerlessness could be profoundly traumatizing. Patients were often treated as objects to be manipulated, rather than individuals with feelings and fears. The very act of being subjected to such procedures, often against one's will, could deepen the sense of despair and further alienate them from reality. Imagine being strapped down, cold water drenching you, or being spun until you vomit, all while being told it's for your own good. The trust, if any existed, would quickly erode, replaced by suspicion and fear. It's no wonder that many patients became more agitated, more withdrawn, or more resistant after undergoing these cures. Historians still debate the long-term effects of these Victorian treatments on patient recovery rates. While some institutions reported cures, the criteria for what constituted a cure were often vague and subjective. Many patients were simply discharged when they became compliant or physically exhausted, only to relapse shortly after returning to society. The true success rate of these methods remains a contentious point among scholars. As you witness these cruel cures, you realize that the asylum is not just a place of confinement, but a crucible of suffering. The treatments, far from offering solace, often added another layer of torment to already troubled minds. It was a desperate era, a time when fear and ignorance often trumped genuine understanding and compassion. And as you step back from this harrowing scene, you carry with you the chilling realization that, for many Victorians, the cure was often as brutal as the illness itself. The echoes of the cruel cure still reverberate in your mind, a chilling reminder of the desperation that defined Victorian approaches to mental illness. Yet, amidst the clanging of chains and the cold spray of hydrotherapy, there was another, more hopeful philosophy that emerged: moral treatment. You've heard whispers of it, seen faint glimmers of its promise in the grandeur, more idyllic descriptions of early asylums. Now you're about to witness its rise, and more tragically, its slow, agonizing fade. You find yourself in a different wing of the asylum, or perhaps in an earlier, smaller institution, where the air feels marginally lighter. The walls are still thick, the windows still barred, but there's a noticeable absence of the more overtly brutal instruments. Here, the emphasis is supposedly on kindness, on routine, on engaging the mind rather than simply subduing the body. This was the core of moral treatment, the belief that mental illness wasn't a demonic possession or an incurable affliction, but often a temporary derangement caused by stress, moral failings, or a lack of self-control, and that it could be cured through a structured, benevolent environment. Imagine a doctor, perhaps a man with a softer gaze and a more gentle demeanor, walking among the patients. He speaks to them, not at them, inquiring about their feelings, their thoughts, their daily activities. The attendants, while still authoritative, are encouraged to use persuasion and encouragement rather than brute force. You might see patients engaged in light work, gardening in a small plot, reading from a limited selection of books, or participating in quiet recreational activities like chess or drawing. It's a stark contrast to the dehumanizing monotony you've experienced before. It's almost like they're trying to treat you like a person, which, after everything, feels revolutionary. A common historical fact about moral treatment is its origins in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, notably at the York Retreat in England, founded by the Quaker William Tuke, and the Bicêtre Hospital in France under Philippe Pinel. These pioneers advocated for unchaining patients, treating them with dignity, and providing a humane environment. They believed that a calm, orderly, and respectful atmosphere, combined with purposeful activity and religious instruction, could help restore reason. This was a radical departure from the prevailing view of madness as something to be feared, punished, or simply locked away. You might be encouraged to take walks in a small, enclosed garden, breathing in the scent of damp earth and blooming roses, the fresh air, the sunlight, the simple beauty of nature. These were considered therapeutic. You might even be allowed to participate in group discussions, sharing your thoughts and feelings, albeit under supervision. The idea was to re-socialize patients, to teach them self-control and appropriate behavior, and to remind them of the virtues of a disciplined life. It was a more nuanced approach, recognizing that the mind, though troubled, was not beyond redemption. One particularly obscure detail from the practice of moral treatment was the emphasis on occupational therapy, not just as a means of keeping patients busy, but as a way to restore their sense of purpose and self-worth. Patients would engage in crafts, agricultural work, or domestic duties, with the belief that productive labor was essential for mental well-being. Sometimes, these activities were even tailored to the patient's former profession or interests, aiming to provide a sense of continuity with their life before the asylum. Imagine a former carpenter being given tools and wood, or a seamstress provided with fabric and needle, a small echo of their former lives, a tangible connection to the world they had lost. It's almost like they realized that a little bit of purpose goes a long way, even if that purpose was just making a very lopsided birdhouse. However, the ideal of moral treatment began to fray under the relentless pressure of increasing patient numbers. As the Victorian population boomed, so did the number of people admitted to asylums. These institutions, initially designed for a few dozen patients, soon swelled to house hundreds, then thousands. The intimate, individualized care that was the cornerstone of moral treatment became impossible to maintain. The staff-to-patient ratio plummeted, and the benevolent, persuasive approach gave way to the practicalities of managing large, often chaotic populations. You see the strain on the attendants' faces. They are overworked, underpaid, and increasingly reliant on physical restraint and sedation simply to maintain order. The gentle persuasion that defined moral treatment is replaced by a weary authoritarianism. The pleasant gardens become overcrowded exercise yards. The quiet discussions turn into shouted commands. The moral aspect of the treatment begins to morph into moralizing. a focus on enforcing strict rules and punishing deviations, rather than fostering genuine recovery. Historians still debate whether the decline of moral treatment was primarily due to its inherent limitations and the growing understanding of the biological basis of some mental illnesses, or simply the overwhelming practical challenges of scaling up a system designed for small, intimate settings. Was it a philosophical failure or a logistical one? The answer is likely a complex interplay of both, but the outcome was clear: the ideal of gentle, humane care was being crushed under the weight of numbers. The shift was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The non-restraint movement, a key tenet of moral treatment, began to erode, while the outright chaining of patients was largely abolished. Other forms of restraint, straitjackets, padded cells, solitary confinement, crept back into common practice. These were often justified as necessary for the safety of the patient or others, but they marked a clear departure from the founding principles of kindness and dignity. You might see a patient, once encouraged to walk freely, now strapped into a chair, their eyes reflecting a deepening despair. The very architecture of the larger, later asylums also reflected this shift. They were built for efficiency and containment, not for intimate care. Long corridors, vast dormitories, and a factory-like approach to patient management replaced the more home-like atmosphere of earlier institutions. The focus moved from individual healing to mass custody. It's like trying to run a boutique hotel with the staff and resources of a bustling train station. The concept of incurability also gained traction. As more patients were admitted and fewer seemed to recover under the strained conditions, the medical profession began to view certain forms of madness as chronic and untreatable. This led to a custodial approach, where the primary goal was simply to house and manage patients for the rest of their lives, rather than to actively cure them. This was a death knell for the optimistic spirit of moral treatment. You might hear a doctor sigh, "There's nothing more we can do," a phrase that seals the fate of countless souls. The rise of the medical model also contributed to the decline. As scientific understanding advanced, albeit slowly and often misguidedly, there was a growing desire to find physical causes and physical cures for mental illness. This led to the proliferation of the doctor's arsenal we discussed earlier: the hydrotherapy, the spinning chairs, the purgatives. While these were often brutal, they represented a shift away from the purely moral and environmental explanations of madness. The mind was increasingly seen as a malfunctioning organ, rather than a soul in distress. You might witness a heated debate between two doctors. One, an older man, clings to the principles of moral treatment, arguing for more staff, smaller wards, and a return to humane care. The other, younger and more scientific, dismisses these ideas as sentimental and unproven, advocating for more aggressive physical interventions. It's a clash of philosophies, a microcosm of the larger struggle within the Victorian medical community. The academic argument still lingers. Kasenhasu hokaban trankai, liususui tan kwa fong, pab jiu tri jau juts ladon hung. Hanse kohu kwa no haichijon, gian ladon hung daj. Thuk tuk te trong vek morong quimo. The social stigma surrounding mental illness also played a significant role in the decline of moral treatment. Despite the best intentions of its proponents, madness remained a source of shame and fear for most Victorians. Families often wanted their unfortunates hidden away, and society preferred to forget about them. This societal pressure made it difficult to advocate for the resources and public support needed to sustain truly humane and individualized care on a large scale. It's hard to get funding for something everyone wants to pretend doesn't exist. The sheer economic burden also contributed. Maintaining large asylums with adequate staff and resources for individualized moral treatment was incredibly expensive. Public funds were often insufficient, and private institutions, while offering better conditions, were only accessible to the wealthy. This meant that the vast majority of patients, particularly the poor, were relegated to overcrowded, underfunded public asylums, where moral treatment was little more than a distant memory. You see the patients who have been in the asylum for years, perhaps even decades. Their faces are etched with the passage of time, their movements slow and institutionalized. They are the living embodiment of the custodial shift, the forgotten souls for whom the promise of moral treatment never truly materialized. They are the ones who bear the brunt of a system that, despite its initial noble aims, ultimately failed to live up to its ideals. The fading ideal of moral treatment is a poignant reminder of the gap between aspiration and reality. It was a philosophy born of compassion and enlightenment, a genuine attempt to treat the mentally ill with dignity and respect. But it was ultimately overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, the limitations of scientific understanding, and the societal pressures that preferred containment over genuine care. The gilded cage, once promising a benevolent sanctuary, became just another cage, its bars now stripped bare of their hopeful veneer. And as you watch the last vestiges of this ideal disappear, you feel a profound sense of loss, not just for the patients, but for a vision of care that was too fragile to survive the harsh realities of the Victorian era. The act of eating, too, could become a subtle battleground. While the food was monotonous and meager, some patients would refuse to eat, or would eat only certain items, a silent protest against their lack of choice and autonomy. This could lead to force feeding, as we discussed, but it was still an assertion of will, a desperate attempt to control one of the few things left to them, their own bodies. A common historical fact about pauper asylums is their rapid and massive expansion during the mid to late Victorian era. The Lunacy Act of 1845 mandated that every county in England and Wales provide an asylum for its pauper lunatics, leading to the construction of enormous institutions designed to house thousands. This was a response to the appalling conditions in workhouses and prisons, where the mentally ill were often cruelly confined. While the intention was to provide dedicated care, the sheer scale quickly overwhelmed any possibility of individualized, humane treatment. It was less about compassion and more about mass containment. You might hear stories of escape attempts, some daring, others tragically futile. A patient might meticulously plan their route, observing the routines of the guards, the weaknesses in the walls, the moments when attention was diverted. These attempts, even if unsuccessful, were powerful symbols of hope, not just for the individuals involved, but for other patients who secretly cheered them on. The very idea that escape was possible, however remote, was a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. Imagine a young woman, perhaps a wife or a daughter, living a life of apparent comfort. Her days are filled with domestic duties, social calls, and the quiet expectation of marriage and motherhood. But beneath the surface, a storm might be brewing. Perhaps she feels stifled by the rigid expectations, bored by the endless needlework, or frustrated by her lack of intellectual outlet. She might experience headaches, fatigue, anxiety, or even a sudden burst of emotion, tears, laughter, or anger that defies the demure ideal of Victorian womanhood. In our time, you might suggest she needs a hobby, a therapist, or perhaps just a good nap. In theirs, the doctor would be called, and the diagnosis, almost inevitably, would be hysteria. Historians still debate the true extent of patient agency and resistance within Victorian asylums. While some accounts emphasize the complete subjugation of patients, others highlight the subtle, often unrecorded, ways in which individuals resisted, adapted, and maintained their sense of self. Was patient resistance primarily a sign of their madness, or a rational response to an oppressive environment? The answer, as always, is complex, but the evidence of resilience is undeniable. You step inside and the difference is immediate and jarring. The corridors are wider, perhaps, but also colder, more utilitarian. The walls are bare, often stained, and the echoes of shuffling feet and distant moans are constant. There's a pervasive sense of overcrowding, a feeling of too many bodies crammed into too little space. The air is heavy, stale, and carries the distinct odor of unwashed bodies, cheap disinfectant, and the lingering scent of despair. This isn't a place of quiet contemplation, it's a holding pen for the unwanted. The act of self-harm, while tragic, could also be seen as a desperate form of control, a way for patients to assert agency over their own bodies when all other forms of control had been stripped away. It was a cry for help, a manifestation of profound despair, but also, in a twisted sense, a final act of defiance against a system that sought to control every aspect of their being. Consider the societal pressure on Victorian women. They were expected to be delicate, pure, and submissive. Any deviation from this ideal was seen as unnatural, even monstrous. The corset, a physical restraint, mirrored the societal constraints placed upon them. When these constraints became too much, When the pressure cooker of expectations finally blew, the resulting distress was often labeled hysteria, neatly sidestepping any critique of the oppressive social structures themselves. You might observe patients forming clandestine friendships, sharing small comforts, offering quiet support to one another. These bonds, forged in adversity, were crucial for emotional survival. A shared glance, a whispered word of encouragement, a simple act of kindness. These were acts of profound resistance against the isolation and dehumanization that the asylum sought to impose. It's like finding your best friend in a very, very bad group project. You observe the patients. They are not neatly dressed in institutional gowns, but often in their own tattered clothing or ill-fitting garments provided by the asylum. Their faces reflect a deeper level of suffering, the kind that comes from years of deprivation before their minds even began to unravel. Many are emaciated, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and listless. Others are agitated, pacing endlessly, muttering to themselves, their voices lost in the cacophony of the ward. The madness itself could sometimes be a form of resistance. A patient deemed delusional might be speaking truths that the system refused to acknowledge. Their irrationality might be a logical response to an irrational environment. Their agitation might be a righteous anger at their unjust confinement. The asylum, by labeling these behaviors as symptoms of illness, effectively dismissed any legitimate grievances or protests. Imagine the frustration of a woman, perhaps an aspiring writer or artist, being told that her very intellect was the cause of her illness, and that the cure lay in absolute inactivity. Her creative impulses, her intellectual curiosity, her desire for independence, all were seen as dangerous, as pathways to madness. The rest cure was designed to reinforce traditional gender roles, to mold women back into passive, domestic beings. It was a cruel irony the very cure often exacerbated the underlying issues. Consider the case of a patient who repeatedly claimed they were sane. Despite being told otherwise by doctors and family, this persistent assertion of sanity, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, was a powerful act of self-affirmation. It was a refusal to accept the label, a desperate clinging to their own reality, however much it differed from the one imposed upon them. The sheer numbers are staggering. You might walk into a dormitory and see rows upon rows of beds, packed tightly together, with barely enough room to walk between them. There's no privacy, no personal space, no respite from the constant presence of others. The noise is relentless. The coughs, the snores, the cries, the endless, low hum of human misery. It's like being trapped in a perpetual, very depressing rush hour. The very act of remembering, of clinging to memories of life outside the asylum, was a form of resistance. The institutions sought to erase the past, to make patients forget who they were. But for many, memories were a lifeline, a connection to a world where they were free, where they had loved ones, where they had an identity beyond patient. You might see a patient quietly tracing patterns on a wall, their eyes distant, lost in a memory that the asylum could not touch. You might see a woman in the asylum, once vibrant and intelligent, now dulled by sedatives, her spirit broken by the rest cure and the endless monotony. Her eyes, once perhaps sparkling with wit, now hold a vacant stare. This is the tragic outcome of a diagnosis that served to control rather than to heal, a medical label that became a tool of social repression. The academic debate still rages. Kach nhasu hok van tronkailu, kach han vikanku kwaben nhan tronkasnha. Thuongjien toi Victoria ko fai labio. Hayen kwaben tam den hei, la fan ong hop, li truoksu apbak. Were these acts of defiance simply symptoms of their illness? Or were they rational responses to an oppressive and dehumanizing environment? The answer, as you now understand, is likely a complex and nuanced one. But the resilience of the human spirit in the face of such adversity is undeniable. One particularly obscure detail about pauper asylums was the practice of pauper burials. When a patient died, if their family could not afford a proper burial, which was often the case, they would be interred in unmarked graves within the asylum grounds or in a pauper's plot in a local cemetery. These graves were often anonymous, sometimes with multiple bodies buried in a single plot, a final indignity for those who had already lived and died in obscurity. Imagine the countless forgotten souls, their names lost to history, buried without ceremony or remembrance. You might also hear about patient petitions or appeals sent to the commissioners in lunacy, the government body responsible for overseeing asylums. While often dismissed or ignored, these formal complaints, written by patients themselves or on their behalf, represent a remarkable attempt to engage with the legal and bureaucratic system, to demand justice and freedom. These were not the incoherent ramblings of the insane, but often articulate, reasoned arguments against their confinement. You might witness a scene where a woman, pale and trembling, complains of a nervous cough or debility. The doctor, a portly man with a serious expression, nods gravely. He doesn't look for underlying causes like malnutrition, overwork, or emotional repression. Instead, his gaze seems to settle on her very womanhood, as if her anatomy itself is the source of her affliction. The diagnosis of hysteria was often less about actual pathology and more about social control, a way to explain and contain women who were deemed too emotional, too assertive, or simply too inconvenient. The sheer volume of patients meant that some, inevitably, slipped through the cracks of the system, finding ways to communicate or even escape. The very inefficiency of an overcrowded institution could, paradoxically, create small windows of opportunity for resistance. It's like trying to keep track of 1,000 marbles in a very large, very leaky bucket. The staff here are even more stretched than in the private asylums. Attendants, often recruited from the ranks of the working class themselves, are poorly paid, overworked, and given little to no formal training in mental health care. Their primary role is simply to manage the masses, to prevent outright chaos, and to ensure that the basic functions of the institution continue. Compassion, while not entirely absent, is a luxury that few can afford to show consistently. Their methods often rely on brute force, intimidation, and the widespread use of sedatives to keep patients docile. The patient voices, though often suppressed, were never entirely silenced. They existed in the whispers, in the shared glances, in the subtle acts of defiance, and in the enduring will to survive. These stories, often unrecorded by the official histories of the asylums, are crucial for understanding the full, brutal truth of the Victorian era. They remind us that even in the darkest of places, the human spirit can find ways to resist, to assert its dignity, and to cling to the hope of freedom. The concept of wandering womb persisted in popular belief, even among some medical professionals, despite growing anatomical knowledge. This ancient idea that the uterus could literally move around the body and cause various ailments was a testament to the enduring power of myth over scientific understanding when it came to female bodies. It's a truly bizarre thought, isn't it? Your womb just decides to go on a little sightseeing tour inside your body, causing havoc wherever it goes. As you listen to these whispers of resistance, you gain a profound appreciation for the resilience of the human mind, even when under immense duress. The patients of Victorian asylums were not just passive victims. They were individuals who, in countless small and large ways, fought to maintain their sanity, their dignity, and their connection to the world they had lost. Their stories, though often tragic, are also a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The treatments you witnessed earlier, hydrotherapy, purgatives, restraints, are also present here, but often applied with less finesse and more severity. There's no pretense of individual care. It's a one-size-fits-all approach, applied indiscriminately to hundreds of patients. You might see a patient being forcefully dragged to a cold bath, their screams echoing down the corridor, while other patients simply watch, their faces devoid of emotion, accustomed to the spectacle. The whispers of resistance, though faint, were never entirely extinguished. They were the first tremors of a slow, arduous shift, the tiny cracks appearing in the formidable walls of the Victorian asylum system. You've seen the darkness, the despair, and the brutal cures. Now you're about to witness the hesitant, often frustrating dawn of reform, as a few brave souls begin to shed light on the hidden truths and demand change. Historians still debate the true impact of the rest cure and whether it was genuinely therapeutic for any women, or if it primarily served to reinforce patriarchal control over female bodies and minds. Was it a misguided attempt at medical care, or a tool of social subjugation? The answer, as with many aspects of Victorian medicine, is complex, but the overwhelming evidence points to its profoundly negative effects on many women. Imagine a determined individual, perhaps a journalist, a concerned physician, or a compassionate social reformer, standing outside the very gates you entered. They are not here to commit a loved one, but to expose the reality within. They carry notebooks, their eyes sharp, their resolve unwavering. These were the early advocates, the ones who dared to challenge the prevailing silence and shame surrounding mental illness. They were often met with resistance, ridicule, and accusations of sensationalism. But their persistence slowly chipped away at the edifice of indifference. Historians still debate the extent to which the conditions in pauper asylums were a deliberate act of cruelty versus an inevitable outcome of underfunding and overcrowding. Was the neglect a conscious policy, or simply the tragic result of a system overwhelmed by demand and starved of resources? The truth likely lies in a grim combination of both, where societal indifference to the poor intersected with a profound lack of understanding about mental illness. A common historical fact is the significant role played by investigative journalism and public inquiries in exposing the deplorable conditions within many Victorian asylums. Figures like Charles Dickens, through his writings, and later journalists like Nellie Bly in America, though slightly later than the core Victorian era. Her methods reflected a growing trend, brought the hidden horrors to public attention. These exposés often detailed overcrowding, neglect, physical abuse, and the lack of proper care, sparking outrage and calls for reform. Imagine reading a shocking newspaper article, perhaps over your morning tea, detailing the very scenes you've witnessed inside these institutions. It was a powerful tool, forcing society to confront what it had long chosen to ignore. The lack of educational and professional opportunities for women also contributed to their vulnerability to hysteria diagnoses. Confined to the domestic sphere, with limited outlets for their talents and ambitions, many women experienced profound frustration and boredom. These feelings, if expressed, could easily be reinterpreted as symptoms of mental instability. A woman who yearned for intellectual engagement might be diagnosed with brain fever if she dared to read too much. You might see a reformer, perhaps a woman dressed in practical, sensible attire, attempting to gain entry to an asylum, or interviewing former attendants and patients who managed to escape or were discharged. Their work was painstaking, often dangerous, and deeply emotionally taxing. They faced a system deeply entrenched in its ways, resistant to external scrutiny, and often protective of its own secrets. Yet they persisted, gathering evidence, compiling reports, and lobbying for legislative change. The diet is even more meager than in the private institution's thin gruel. Coarse bread, watery soup. Malnutrition is common, and many patients suffer from chronic physical ailments in addition to their mental distress. The sanitation is often poor, leading to outbreaks of disease. You see patients with skin conditions, respiratory illnesses, and the general signs of a body slowly failing under the weight of neglect. It's a constant battle against hunger, cold, and illness, even within the supposed sanctuary of the asylum. One particularly obscure detail is the existence of visiting committees or boards of visitors appointed to inspect asylums. While these committees were often composed of local magistrates and gentry who might not have had medical expertise, some individuals on these boards took their roles seriously. They would conduct unannounced visits, interview patients sometimes in private, and scrutinize the asylum's records. Their reports, though often sanitized for public consumption, sometimes contained damning evidence of neglect and abuse, providing crucial ammunition for reformers. Imagine a sudden knock on the asylum door, and a group of stern-faced gentlemen demanding to see the wards, a rare moment of external accountability. It's like a surprise inspection from the health department, but with more top hats and less actual health. As the faint hope of moral treatment recedes like a distant ship on a foggy sea, a new, insidious shadow begins to loom, particularly over half the population. You are now standing in a drawing room, the scent of lavender and polished wood filling the air, a stark contrast to the antiseptic chill of the asylum. Here, amidst the delicate lace and hushed conversations, you begin to understand the peculiar plight of Victorian women, trapped not just by societal expectations, but by a medical diagnosis that became a gendered prison female hysteria. The legislative landscape also began to shift, albeit slowly. The Lunacy Act of 1845, while leading to the construction of more public asylums, also introduced the concept of commissioners in lunacy. This central body was tasked with overseeing the care of the mentally ill and inspecting asylums regularly. While their powers were initially limited and their resources stretched thin, they represented a crucial step towards national oversight and accountability. You might see their formal official reports, filled with dry statistics and bureaucratic language, yet containing within them the seeds of future change. The work assigned to patients is often heavy and relentless. Men might be put to work in the asylum's farms, breaking rocks or performing arduous manual labor. Women might be engaged in endless laundry, scrubbing floors, or preparing food for hundreds. This wasn't therapeutic occupation, it was forced labor, a way to reduce the asylum's operating costs and to keep patients too exhausted to cause trouble. You might find yourself lifting heavy sacks, your muscles aching, your mind too numb to even think of resistance. The medical profession itself, though often complicit in the abuses, also contained voices of reform. Progressive psychiatrists and alienists, as they were then called, began to question the efficacy of brutal treatments and the purely custodial approach. They advocated for more humane methods, better training for attendants, and a greater emphasis on understanding the underlying causes of mental illness. They were often a minority voice within their own field, battling against entrenched conservatism and the sheer inertia of a massive system. The legal system offered little protection. A husband could commit his wife to an asylum without her consent, and it was incredibly difficult for a woman to challenge such a commitment. Her word, if she was already labeled hysterical, would carry little weight against the testimony of her husband or a male doctor. This left countless women vulnerable to wrongful confinement, their voices silenced, their freedom stolen. Historians still debate whether the impetus for asylum reform came primarily from external philanthropic and journalistic pressure, or from internal changes within the medical profession itself. Was it a top-down or bottom-up movement? The truth, as with most complex social changes, likely involved a dynamic interplay between both, with public outcry creating the political will for change, and progressive medical professionals providing the intellectual framework for new approaches. The lack of stimulation is even more profound here. There are no books, no games, no recreational activities beyond pacing the crowded wards or staring blankly at the walls. The days are an endless cycle of eating, working, and existing in a state of profound sensory deprivation. The minds of the patients, already fragile, are further eroded by this relentless monotony, leading many to become utterly institutionalized, losing all connection to their former selves. It's like being put on permanent mute and then having the volume turned down on the world. You might witness a public lecture, perhaps in a crowded town hall, where a reformer speaks passionately about the plight of asylum inmates. They describe the overcrowding, the lack of sanitation, the physical restraints, and the profound human suffering. The audience, initially skeptical, slowly begins to stir, their faces reflecting a growing sense of shock and indignation. This public awareness, this collective awakening, was essential for building momentum for reform, for those deemed more severely hysterical, or those whose unruly behavior could not be controlled by rest cures. The asylum awaited. You might be committed by your husband, father, or brother, often with little or no say in the matter. Once inside, the diagnosis of hysteria would follow you, justifying the same treatments applied to other lunatics: hydrotherapy, sedatives, and physical restraint. The asylum became the ultimate gendered prison, a place where women who dared to defy societal norms even subtly could be locked away and silenced. The very concept of mental hygiene began to emerge, advocating for preventative measures and early intervention, rather than simply locking people away once their minds had completely broken. This nascent idea, though far from fully developed, represented a shift towards a more proactive and less punitive approach to mental health. It suggested that society had a responsibility not just to contain the mad, but to prevent madness where possible. You might witness a patient, once a vibrant individual, now reduced to a shuffling, mumbling shadow, their personality completely subsumed by the asylum. This is the tragic outcome of a system that prioritized containment over care and cost-cutting over human dignity. These individuals, once members of society, are now merely inmates, their lives defined by the walls that surround them. The role of former patients, though often marginalized and dismissed, was also crucial. Some, upon discharge, bravely spoke out about their experiences, detailing the abuses they had suffered and advocating for better conditions. Their personal testimonies, though often disbelieved, added a powerful human dimension to the abstract debates about asylum reform. Imagine the courage it took for someone to recount their trauma, knowing they might be labeled mad all over again. It's like testifying against a dragon, knowing it still breathes fire. As you are led deeper into the asylum, you start to notice the subtle cracks in the gilded cage. The quiet is no longer peaceful. It feels heavy, oppressive. The air, initially just still, now seems to carry a faint metallic tang, perhaps from the iron bars that you now see on some of the windows. The grand architecture begins to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress. The moral treatment ideal, while beautiful in theory, often buckled under the weight of increasing patient numbers and dwindling resources. The sheer economic burden of maintaining massive, overcrowded asylums also became a driver for reform. The cost of simply warehousing thousands of patients was enormous, and taxpayers began to question the efficiency and humanity of the system. This financial pressure, while not always driven by altruism, certainly provided a practical incentive for exploring alternative, more cost-effective, and hopefully more humane approaches. The legacy of female hysteria is long and painful. It contributed to the medicalization of normal female experiences, the dismissal of women's pain and concerns, and the reinforcement of harmful stereotypes. Even after the diagnosis of hysteria faded from medical textbooks in the early 20th century, its underlying assumptions about female emotionality and irrationality continue to influence medical practice and societal attitudes for decades. You might see discussions about the need for smaller, more specialized institutions or for community-based care, ideas that were radical for their time. While these concepts wouldn't fully materialize until much later, the seeds of such thinking were planted in the late Victorian era as reformers grappled with the failures of the large asylum model. The legal framework, while theoretically offering some protections, was often circumvented or simply ignored for the poor. Families wide, if they existed, might be desperate to shed the burden of a mentally ill relative. And the commitment process for paupers was often swift and lacking in due process. Once inside, escape was virtually impossible, and discharge was rare, often only occurring when a patient was deemed harmless or when they were too frail to survive outside. The academic debate still rages. Kakna su hokvantran kai liu kat kai kash. Trong viex jiu tri benhtam dan thoi. Victoria kautuk su dan genzu. Kaitin jankevajuk in songkwa benhan. Hai chijont huan. La su tai joy trong kach kwanli. Did the reforms genuinely improve the lives of patients? Or did they merely represent a shift in the methods of control and containment, without fundamentally altering the underlying dehumanization? The answer is complex, with progress often being slow, uneven, and marked by significant setbacks. One particularly obscure detail related to hysteria was the pelvic massage, or manual manipulation performed by doctors to induce paroxysms orgasms, which were believed to relieve the symptoms of hysteria. This practice, often conducted in the doctor's office, was a regular treatment for many women. Imagine the utter indignity, the violation of such a procedure, all under the guise of medical care. It was a bizarre and disturbing intersection of medical ignorance, societal repression, and thinly veiled sexual exploitation. It's enough to make you want to invent the vibrator a century early. The struggle for reform was not a sudden revolution, but a slow, incremental process, marked by small victories and frustrating defeats. It involved countless individuals, often working in isolation, chipping away at a deeply entrenched system. It was a testament to the power of persistent advocacy, the courage of whistleblowers, and the gradual awakening of public conscience. The sheer anonymity of the pauper's plight is heartbreaking. Unlike the wealthy, whose confinement might be a source of scandal, the poor simply disappeared. Their stories were untold, their suffering unseen by the wider world. They were the forgotten souls, swallowed by the vast, impersonal machinery of the Victorian welfare state, their lives ending in quiet despair within the asylum walls. You might witness the passage of a new regulation, perhaps mandating better ventilation in wards, or limiting the use of certain restraints. These were not dramatic changes, but they represented progress, a recognition that the conditions within asylums were indeed problematic and required intervention. Each small step, each minor improvement, was a hard-won battle against indifference and inertia. You might reflect on the pioneering women who dared to challenge these notions, like Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to earn a medical degree in the United States, who fought against the prevailing misogyny in medicine. Their struggles highlight the immense barriers faced by women who sought to understand and treat female health outside the confines of patriarchal assumptions. The very language used to describe mental illness also began to evolve, moving slowly away from purely moralistic or superstitious terms towards a more medicalized, albeit still rudimentary, understanding. This shift in discourse, while not immediately translating into better care, was crucial for laying the groundwork for future scientific inquiry and more humane approaches. The academic debate still rages. Case na suhok van trankai liu sugyatan kao na thuong, jian don chong going heo ko fai lamot gyai papnan. Jiao chon hung goy baben tam tan hai. Lamot kach thuan tianchiluai bon hung goy kong mong muon koi ksa hoi. Was it a genuine attempt to provide care, or a convenient way to manage the social problem of poverty and mental illness by simply locking it away? The answer, as you can see, is deeply troubling. As you observe these nascent efforts at reform, you realize that the brutal truth of Victorian mental illness was not just about the suffering within the asylums, but also about the immense struggle required to bring that suffering to light and to demand change. The seeds of change were indeed sown, but they would take many decades, even centuries, to truly blossom into a more compassionate and scientifically informed approach to mental health care. The fight for dignity and understanding was just beginning. The very definition of female madness was inextricably linked to societal expectations of womanhood. A woman who was too emotional, too intellectual, too independent, or who simply didn't conform to the ideal of the submissive, domestic angel, was at risk of being labeled hysterical. Her symptoms were not seen as a response to external pressures or internal struggles, but as inherent flaws in her female nature. It was a circular logic: you were mad because you were a woman, and you were a woman, therefore you were prone to madness. It's like saying your car breaks down because it's a car, and it's a car, therefore it's prone to breaking down. The faint glimmer of reform, though still distant, offers a fragile hope. You've witnessed the brutal reality of Victorian mental illness, from the initial confinement to the cruel cures, the gendered prisons, and the forgotten souls of the pauper asylums. Now, as our journey nears its end, you are left to ponder the lingering echoes of this dark chapter in history, and how its brutal legacy continues to shape our understanding of mental health today. You might see children in these asylums, too. Children with developmental disabilities, epilepsy, or simply those who were orphaned and deemed unmanageable. Their presence is a particularly stark reminder of the era's lack of understanding and compassion. Imagine a child, confused and frightened, confined alongside adults, subjected to the same harsh routines and treatments. It's a truly heartbreaking sight, a testament to the brutal realities faced by the most vulnerable. Imagine standing on a bridge, looking back at the vast, imposing structures of the asylums, now fading into the mists of time. They are no longer operational, their walls perhaps crumbling, their grounds overgrown. Yet their shadows stretch long, reaching into the present, influencing the very language we use, the stigmas we carry, and the systems we have built to care for troubled minds. The Victorian era, for all its industrial might and social rigidity, left an indelible mark on the landscape of mental health, a mark that we are still, in many ways, struggling to erase. The academic debate still rages. Kak na su hok van trankai liu chan joan ben kwong loan, o pu nu ko fai lamot hin. Thuk kiem soat shan hoi hon lamot chan joan ite hople hai kong. Was it a genuine, albeit misunderstood, illness, or primarily a reflection of a society grappling with changing gender roles and seeking to enforce conformity? The evidence strongly suggests the latter, revealing hysteria as a powerful tool for maintaining the Victorian social order. A common historical fact is that the large custodial asylums of the Victorian era continued to operate well into the 20th century, with many only closing their doors in the latter half of the century as part of the deinstitutionalization movement. This means that the legacy of these institutions, their methods, and their impact on generations of patients extended far beyond the Victorian period itself. Imagine a person born in the early 20th century, still experiencing the remnants of a system designed in the 19th. The echoes were not just historical, they were lived realities for many. As you turn away from the overwhelming despair of the pauper's asylum, you carry with you the profound understanding that, for the vast majority of Victorians suffering from mental illness, their fate was inextricably linked to their social class. For the forgotten souls, the asylum was not a sanctuary, but a final, desolate prison, where their lives slowly faded into anonymity, a chilling testament to a society that struggled to reconcile its industrial might with its human failings. You might hear a modern conversation about mental illness, perhaps someone whispering about nervous breakdowns or going mad. These phrases, seemingly innocuous, are direct linguistic descendants of the Victorian era, carrying with them the historical baggage of shame, fear, and misunderstanding. The very act of labeling someone as mad or insane still carries a weight that is difficult to shake, a direct inheritance from a time when such labels meant confinement and dehumanization. It's like trying to get rid of a stubborn stain on a very old carpet. Some marks just linger. A common historical fact is that hysteria was a catch-all diagnosis for a vast array of symptoms exhibited by women, ranging from anxiety, insomnia, irritability, and fainting spells to more dramatic manifestations like paralysis, spasms, or even sexual desire. It was believed to originate in the uterus from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb, and its wandering nature was thought to cause disturbances throughout the female body and mind. It was a convenient explanation for any female behavior that deviated from the norm, a medical label that pathologized female experience itself. It was basically the Victorian equivalent of saying, "Bless her heart, she's just being a woman." One particularly obscure detail is the architectural legacy of Victorian asylums. Many of these imposing buildings, once symbols of confinement, have been repurposed into apartments, universities, or even museums. Imagine living in a building where, a century ago, people were subjected to hydrotherapy or solitary confinement. While the physical structures may have new purposes, the history embedded in their walls, the stories of suffering and resilience, continue to resonate, a silent reminder of a past that cannot be easily forgotten. It's like moving into a house and finding out the previous owners were really into, well, intense interior design. The oppressive weight of the pauper's asylum still lingers in your memory, a stark testament to the forgotten souls. But even within those grim walls, amidst the despair and the relentless routine, there were whispers, faint, defiant murmurs of resistance, small acts of rebellion, and the enduring human spirit clinging to a sliver of hope. You are now attuned to these echoes, listening for the patient voices that dared to defy the system, to assert their humanity in the face of dehumanization. The stigma surrounding mental illness is perhaps the most enduring and insidious legacy of the Victorian era. When madness was viewed as a moral failing, a sign of weakness, or something to be hidden away, it created a deep-seated shame that persists to this day. People still fear being judged, discriminated against, or dismissed if they admit to struggling with their mental health. This reluctance to speak openly, to seek help, is a direct consequence of centuries of societal attitudes that began to solidify in the Victorian period. As you step away from this unsettling glimpse into the gendered prison of Victorian mental illness, you carry with you the profound understanding of how deeply societal anxieties can intertwine with medical practice, especially when it comes to those deemed other. For Victorian women, the brutal truth was that their very nature could be deemed a pathology, leading to confinement and control. All under the guise of care, historians still debate the extent to which the Victorian asylum system, despite its flaws, laid any groundwork for modern psychiatric care. While the methods were often brutal and the understanding rudimentary, some argue that the very act of bringing the mentally ill out of workhouses and prisons and into dedicated institutions was a necessary, if flawed, step towards recognizing their specific needs. Was it a foundation, however shaky, or merely a detour on the path to genuine care? The answer remains a contentious point among scholars. Imagine a quiet corner of a crowded ward where two patients exchange a knowing glance. One might subtly pass a scrap of paper, a crude drawing, or a few hastily scribbled words. This isn't just idle chatter. It's a lifeline, a connection in a world designed to isolate. These small acts of communication, often conducted under the watchful eyes of attendants, were vital for maintaining a sense of self, a shared reality that existed outside the asylum's imposed narrative. You might reflect on the evolution of psychiatric diagnoses. The vague, all-encompassing labels of the Victorian era, melancholia, mania, hysteria, have been replaced by a much more nuanced and scientifically informed understanding of mental health conditions. We now have specific diagnostic criteria, a deeper understanding of neurobiology, and a range of evidence-based treatments. Yet, the ghost of those old labels, the tendency to simplify complex human suffering into broad, often judgmental categories, still occasionally rears its head. You might hear stories of women committed for moral insanity simply because they had an affair, or expressed a desire for a career outside the home, or even because they challenged their husband's authority. These were not medical conditions, but social transgressions, yet they were pathologized and treated as madness. The asylum provided a convenient solution for families seeking to control difficult women or to maintain their reputation. The concept of moral treatment, despite its ultimate failure to scale, left a lasting philosophical imprint. Its emphasis on humane care, structured routine, and purposeful activity, however imperfectly applied, influenced later reformers and contributed to the development of more patient-centered approaches. The idea that mental illness could be treated with kindness and respect, rather than just coercion, was a radical notion that, though often lost in the chaos of overcrowding, never entirely disappeared. You might observe a patient, seemingly compliant, performing their assigned task with a methodical slowness that subtly undermines the efficiency demanded by the staff. Or perhaps another, when questioned about their delusions, offers a response so convoluted and nonsensical that it effectively shuts down further interrogation, a linguistic shield against intrusion. These were not grand revolts, but quiet acts of defiance, a way for patients to reclaim a tiny sliver of control in an environment where control was systematically denied. You might see the parallels between the Victorian fear of madness and contemporary anxieties about social deviation or nonconformity. While we no longer lock people away for female hysteria, society still struggles with accepting and accommodating those who don't fit neatly into prescribed norms. The impulse to categorize, to control, to other those who are different, is a human tendency that the Victorian era starkly illuminated. It's like a very old, very uncomfortable family heirloom that just keeps getting passed down. The drawing room, with its stifling air of polite repression, fades from your vision, replaced by the harsh reality of another, even more desolate corner of the Victorian world. You are now standing outside a different kind of asylum, one that lacks the grand facade and manicured lawns. This is a public asylum, a pauper's asylum, and the air here is thick with the scent of poverty, neglect, and the sheer weight of human numbers. Here, the brutal truth of Victorian mental illness is laid bare, stripped of any pretense of moral treatment or gilded cages. This is where the forgotten souls were sent, to be swallowed by a system overwhelmed by its own scale. The fight for patient rights, for autonomy and dignity, also has its roots in the Victorian era. The early reformers and the brave patients who spoke out against abuses laid the groundwork for later advocacy movements that demanded better conditions, legal protections, and a greater say in one's own treatment. The struggles of those forgotten souls were not in vain. Their suffering, though immense, contributed to a slow but undeniable shift towards a more ethical approach to mental health care. A common historical fact is that despite the harsh conditions and strict controls, patients in Victorian asylums often found ways to communicate with the outside world, sometimes by smuggling out letters or appealing to visitors. While many such attempts were intercepted, the sheer persistence of these efforts highlights the enduring desire for freedom and connection. Imagine the courage it took to write a letter, knowing it might be read, ridiculed, or simply destroyed. Yet writing it anyway, the academic debate still rages. Kaak na suhok vantran kailu supan lawai vagyam yun ng guay bibentam. Then toi Victoria ko fai lamot buak kenthiet trong su pat trienquatam, than hoc he lamot salem, yem trong jan kentrosu tienbo. Was the Victorian approach a necessary, if brutal, phase in the development of psychiatry, or a fundamental misstep that set back progress for decades? The answer is complex, but it forces us to confront the ethical dilemmas inherent in any society's attempt to manage mental suffering. The prescribed cures for hysteria were as varied and often as bizarre as the symptoms themselves. The rest cures popularized by American physician S. Weir Mitchell that was a particularly common and debilitating treatment. You might find yourself confined to bed for weeks or even months, isolated from family and friends, forbidden to read, write, or engage in any stimulating activity. Your diet would be limited, and you would be force-fed milk and gruel. The idea was to conserve nervous energy and to prevent the overstimulation believed to cause hysteria. For active, intelligent women, this enforced idleness could be a form of psychological torture, leading to further depression and despair. You might consider the role of poverty and social inequality in mental health, a connection that was brutally evident in the pauper asylums. While modern societies have made strides in welfare and social support, the link between socioeconomic status and mental well-being remains a critical issue. The Victorian era serves as a stark reminder that mental illness is not just an individual affliction, but often a symptom of broader societal inequities. You might encounter a patient who, despite being labeled delusional, maintains an intricate internal world, a rich fantasy life that serves as an escape from the harsh realities of their confinement. They might speak in riddles or tell elaborate stories that seem nonsensical to the attendants, but which, to another patient, might reveal a hidden meaning, a shared understanding of their predicament. This mental resilience, this ability to create an inner sanctuary, was a powerful form of resistance against the asylum's attempts to erase their individuality. The very idea of asylum itself, as a place of refuge, has been reevaluated. While the large, isolated institutions have largely been replaced by community-based care, the challenge of providing safe, supportive, and effective environments for those with severe mental illness remains. The Victorian experiment in mass institutionalization offers crucial lessons about the dangers of overcrowding, underfunding, and the dehumanizing effects of confinement without genuine care. Imagine the sheer desperation that would lead someone to this place, not the wealthy, whose families could afford private care, however misguided. No, this is the final destination for the destitute, the orphaned, the widowed, the unemployed, whose minds had fractured under the relentless pressure of Victorian life. You see them shuffling through the gates, their clothes ragged, their faces etched with hunger and hardship. They are not just mentally ill, they are also desperately poor. And in Victorian society, that was often a double condemnation. As you reflect on this long, dark journey, you realize that the brutal truth about how Victorians treated mental illness is not just a historical curiosity, it is a mirror, reflecting our own ongoing struggles with understanding, accepting, and caring for the human mind. The shadows of those asylums, the whispers of those forgotten souls, and the enduring stigma they faced serve as a powerful reminder of how far we have come and how much further we still have to go. The fight for true compassion, understanding, and dignity in mental health care is a continuous journey, one that began in many ways in the gaslit streets and imposing walls of Victorian England. And now, as the stories of the past have subsided, let the images slowly fade into the night. Take a deep breath, feel the warm blanket wrap around you, and let your mind drift gently. The echoes of the Victorian era, the pain and reform efforts, are now just gentle waves in your memory. You have traveled through a harsh era, but now it is time to return to the peace of the present. Let your worries fade, your tensions ease, and feel the silence. The night falls, bringing with it rest. Close your eyes and let sleep gently carry you away into a world of sweet dreams, where all your worries fade away. One particularly obscure detail is the use of patient newspapers or magazines that were sometimes created within asylums, often by the patients themselves, with varying degrees of staff oversight. These publications, though rare and often ephemeral, offered a unique glimpse into the patient's perspectives, their grievances, their humor, and their enduring hopes. Imagine a crude handwritten newsletter passed around furtively, filled with poems, satirical observations about asylum life, or even coded messages of solidarity. It was a fragile yet potent form of self-expression, a testament to the fact that even behind bars, the human voice could not be entirely silenced. It's like a very depressing version of a high school yearbook. But with more existential angst, the medical establishment of the time, overwhelmingly male, held immense power over women's lives. Doctors, often without proper understanding of female anatomy or psychology, made pronouncements that dictated women's fates. Their theories were often rooted in misogyny, viewing women as inherently weaker, more emotional, and more susceptible to mental derangement than men. This patriarchal lens shaped diagnoses, treatments, and ultimately, the lived experience of countless women